Today, we're diving into an inspiring story of unexpected change and redemption. It all begins with Michael, a decorated soldier heading back home after his latest deployment, eager for the rare luxury of a first-class flight. But what should have been a peaceful, well-deserved break quickly escalates into conflict when he encounters unfair treatment from a fellow passenger named Karen. Her prejudiced behavior sets off a series of events that not only tests Michael's character, but also sparks an unexpected chain reaction that transforms both of their lives forever. What made Michael's calm reaction have such profound consequences? How did this single moment reveal deeper truths and inspire genuine change? Stay tuned to find out. And before we get started, let us know where you're tuning in from today. If this story of strength and transformation resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Michael let out a slow breath as he navigated through the airport. His duffel bag weighed heavily, reminding him of the distance he'd traveled. His tired eyes swept over the bustling terminal, full of people caught up in their own worlds, heads down and moving quickly. Yet, he remained calm. Worn out, yes, but calm. It felt good to be back. After months in far-off lands, putting his life on the line, the thought of finally reuniting with his family felt like the reward he'd been waiting for. He walked with purpose, though his steps were slower than usual. The soreness in his muscles and the stiffness in his legs told the story of a body that had endured more than most could imagine. Still, he carried himself with pride, his freshly pressed uniform standing out in the crowd. He was used to the looks his uniform attracted. It was part of his life. Michael held his first-class ticket firmly in hand, the crisp paper a reassuring presence. It was a small indulgence he'd given himself after everything he'd been through. He remembered the moment he bought it, hesitating because he thought he could use that money for his wife or daughter. But after weeks of back-to-back missions and nights spent under open skies in conflict zones, he felt he'd earned it. This first-class seat wasn't just about comfort. It was a brief respite, a small piece of peace away from the chaos. As he approached the check-in counter, the familiar hum of the airport surrounded him, the sound of rolling luggage, passengers chatting, muffled announcements. He offered the attendant a polite but weary smile as she scanned his boarding pass. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said, handing it back with a nod of respect. Michael nodded in return, appreciative but not in need of the constant reminders. All he wanted was to get home, to see his family, to hold his daughter close again. Just thinking about it made his heart ache with longing. Just a few more hours, he told himself. As he walked toward the first-class lounge, his mind wandered to all he had been through. The long nights patrolling, the friends he'd lost, the decisions that still weighed on him. But he also remembered the good. Those moments of camaraderie, the deep sense of purpose that had driven him to enlist in the first place. Every sacrifice had led him to this moment, and soon he'd be with his family. That was all that mattered. Seeing the first-class boarding area, he felt a wave of relief, a moment to sit down and relax before the long flight. He scanned the plush seats, most already taken by business travelers or couples quietly chatting. His gaze eventually fell on a woman seated by the window. She was hard to miss, well-dressed in a tailored jacket and designer shoes, exuding an aura of entitlement. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, a designer handbag resting on the seat next to her. Everything about her screamed luxury, from her sparkling watch to the way she carried herself, chin slightly raised as she surveyed the room. Michael didn't think much of her initially. He wasn't one to judge based on appearances. After all, his experiences in the military had taught him that looks could be deceiving. But as he approached the empty seat beside her, he noticed her shift. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a line. "Excuse me," Michael said politely, stopping by the seat next to her. "I believe that's my seat." Karen didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked him up and down, her expression filled with thinly veiled disdain, as if she were deciding if he was worth responding to. Finally, she spoke, her tone dripping with condescension. "Are you sure?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Her eyes flicked to his uniform, then back to his face. "This is first class." Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "Yes, I'm sure. This is my seat." Karen leaned back, her manicured fingers tapping on the armrest as she looked him over again, this time with more scrutiny. Her eyes made it clear she didn't believe someone like him belonged in first class. "Well, I find that hard to believe," she said, her voice light but tinged with insult. "You must have made a mistake. This is for first-class passengers." Michael took a steadying breath. He'd dealt with much worse, and he wasn't about to let this woman ruin his day. But there was a part of him that bristled at her words and the blatant disrespect from a stranger who knew nothing about him. After everything he'd been through, he didn't deserve this. "I didn't make a mistake," he said firmly. "I have a first-class ticket, and this is my seat." Karen pursed her lips, unimpressed. She looked around, perhaps hoping someone would come to her aid. When no one did, she sighed, exasperated. "Well, you'll have to forgive me for being skeptical," she whispered, though loud enough for him to hear. "It's just not what I expected." Michael narrowed his gaze, knowing exactly what she meant. This wasn't his first encounter with someone making assumptions based on his appearance, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. Before he could respond, a flight attendant approached, noticing the tension. She offered a polite smile, though her eyes darted between Michael and Karen. "Is everything okay here?" the attendant asked cautiously. Karen jumped in quickly, her tone dripping with self-importance. "I think there's been a mistake. This gentleman seems to think he's supposed to be sitting here in first class, but I find that highly unlikely." The flight attendant glanced at Michael, who handed her his ticket without a word. She looked it over, her eyes widening slightly as she saw the seat assignment. "There's no mistake," the attendant said kindly but firmly. "This is Mr. Carter's seat." Karen blinked in shock, clearly unprepared for this answer. She hesitated, then quickly composed herself, her expression hardening. "Well, I just find that very unusual," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for both Michael and the flight attendant to hear. The attendant, sensing the tension could escalate, smiled tightly. "I assure you, ma'am, everything is in order." She turned to Michael. "Mr. Carter, if you'd like to take your seat, we'll be boarding shortly." Michael nodded, thankful for her support. He stepped forward, placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and took his seat next to Karen, who shifted uncomfortably, clearly displeased. As he settled in, Michael felt a swirl of frustration, anger, and relief. He'd faced worse than an entitled woman with prejudiced assumptions, but it still hurt. All he wanted was a peaceful flight, yet things were off to a rough start. Looking out the window, he tried to focus on getting home, imagining the moment he'd see his family again. But Karen's presence was a reminder of the biases that still lingered, even in places as simple as an airport. Michael took a deep breath and closed his eyes, choosing to let it go. He'd come too far to let this woman ruin the moment he'd waited so long for. Sitting there staring out the window, he worked to calm his mind after the unpleasant exchange. Karen's cold attitude had shaken him, but he wasn't going to let it ruin his day. After all, he'd endured far worse than this. Karen, however, wasn't finished. She kept glancing at Michael from the corner of her eye, her lips pressed into a hard line. Every now and then, she'd let out a loud, annoyed sigh, making it obvious she wasn't pleased with the seating arrangement. Finally, unable to hold back, she turned toward Michael, her tone sharp and cutting. "Are you sure you're supposed to be sitting here?" she asked, raising an eyebrow, her voice full of accusation, as if she expected to catch him in a lie. "I mean, this is first class." Michael briefly looked at her, then back to the window. He wasn't in the mood for more confrontation, but she clearly wasn't letting it go. "Yes," he replied, his tone calm, yet firm. Karen scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "I don't know how you managed to get that seat," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Surely there had to be some kind of mix-up. Michael clenched his jaw, feeling the tension building in his chest. He sensed the curious eyes of nearby passengers, watching the scene unfold. He didn't want to cause a fuss or draw attention to himself, but Karen was pushing him to the edge. "I didn't make a mistake," Michael said, keeping his tone level. "I bought this ticket." Karen crossed her arms, her expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. "You bought a first-class ticket?" she asked, her voice dripping with doubt. "I find that hard to believe." Michael took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He understood what she was implying, even if she hadn't said it outright. It was obvious. Her disbelief stemmed from his skin color, plain and simple. "Believe what you want," Michael replied quietly, his patience beginning to wear thin. "But this is my seat." Karen huffed, clearly unsatisfied with his response. She turned to the aisle, gesturing to a flight attendant with dramatic urgency. "I need you to check this man's ticket," Karen demanded as the flight attendant approached. Her voice was loud enough to catch everyone's attention, drawing even more eyes toward their row. "There must be some sort of mistake. He doesn't belong in first class." The flight attendant, a young woman in her mid-20s, seemed surprised by the accusation and glanced apologetically at Michael before addressing Karen. "Ma'am, I've already checked his ticket," she said, maintaining her professionalism despite the awkward situation. "He's in the correct seat." "Well, I don't think that's right," Karen insisted, her voice growing more forceful. "There's no way he paid for a first-class seat." Michael tightened his grip on the armrest, choosing to stay silent. He didn't need to prove himself to her. He knew his worth and wouldn't let her words get under his skin. But he couldn't ignore the sting of her blatant disrespect. The flight attendant hesitated, looking back and forth between Michael and Karen. "Ma'am, I assure you, everything is in order," she said, her tone polite yet firm. "There's no mistake." Karen shook her head, clearly unsatisfied. "You need to check again," she said, her voice cold and insistent. "This man doesn't fit the profile of someone who flies first class. I don't know how he got this seat, but there's been some kind of mix-up, and I expect you to fix it." Michael felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. The prejudice was now undeniable, spilling out for everyone to hear. He looked around the cabin, noticing the other passengers shifting uncomfortably, their glances darting between him and Karen. Some passengers looked embarrassed, while others seemed like they wanted to intervene but weren't sure how. The flight attendant, keeping her cool, turned to Michael and gave him an apologetic smile. "Sir, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience," she said gently. "Could I please see your ticket again just to confirm?" Michael exhaled softly and reached into his pocket to retrieve his boarding pass, handing it over without a word. The flight attendant carefully examined it before looking up and nodding. "Everything is correct," she said, turning back to Karen. "This is Mr. Carter's seat." Karen's face flushed with irritation. She opened her mouth to argue, but the flight attendant quickly stepped in, her tone now more authoritative. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to please stop harassing Mr. Carter. His ticket is valid, and he has every right to be in this seat. If there are any further issues, I will have to involve the captain." Karen snapped her mouth shut, her eyes blazing with frustration. For a moment, it seemed she might argue more, but she seemed to think better of it. With an exasperated sigh, she crossed her arms and sank back in her seat, glaring at the back of the seat in front of her as though it had wronged her. Michael let out a quiet breath, feeling the tension in the air start to ease. The flight attendant handed him back his ticket with a sympathetic smile. "Thank you for your patience, sir," she said softly. "I'm truly sorry for the inconvenience." Michael nodded, appreciating her professionalism. "It's not your fault," he replied quietly. The flight attendant gave him a small nod and walked away, her posture still tense from the effort of keeping her composure. Michael watched her retreat down the aisle, feeling both relieved and frustrated. He was grateful the situation hadn't gone further, but Karen's words still lingered. Determined to focus on the positive, he settled back in his seat, reminding himself that he was almost home. Soon, he'd be with his wife and daughter, and all of this would just be a distant memory. He only needed to get through the next few hours, but Karen wasn't ready to let things go. Even though the flight attendant had set her straight, she couldn't seem to let go of her frustration. She turned toward Michael, her eyes narrowing. "You know, this whole thing is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, but loudly enough for Michael to hear. "I don't know why everyone's making such a big deal out of this. It's just a misunderstanding." Michael remained silent. He saw no point in engaging further. Anything he said would fall on deaf ears. "I mean, it's not like I said anything that bad," Karen continued, her tone dripping with self-righteousness. "People are so sensitive these days. You can't say anything without someone getting offended." Michael clenched his jaw, holding back the urge to respond. He knew replying would only fuel her fire. He focused on his breathing, reminding himself that this was temporary. Soon, he'd be off this plane, far from Karen's negative energy. But his silence only seemed to encourage her to keep going. "It's not like I was being rude," she insisted, her voice rising. "I just asked a simple question. It's not my fault if people jump to conclusions." Michael finally turned to her, his gaze steady and firm. "You didn't ask a question," he said, his voice low and controlled. "You made an assumption." Karen blinked, momentarily taken aback by his calm confrontation. For a split second she looked as if she was considering her response, but her expression quickly hardened. "Well, excuse me for being surprised," she snapped. "I don't usually see—" Michael raised a hand, cutting her off. "You don't need to explain," he said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I know exactly what you meant." Karen stared at him, her mouth open, seemingly shocked that he'd dared to respond so directly. For a brief moment, it looked like she might argue more, but she quickly clamped her mouth shut, turning away from him with a loud, annoyed huff. Michael shook his head and looked back out the window. He wasn't going to let her drag him into a pointless argument. He had dealt with people like Karen before, those who hid their biases behind subtle digs and smug smiles. He knew better than to let it get under his skin. As the minutes ticked by, Michael tried to focus on the joy of seeing his family again, though it was hard to fully relax with Karen just inches away, radiating hostility. A few rows up, an older couple exchanged uneasy glances, visibly uncomfortable with the tension in the air. A young man with earbuds in stared at his phone, but his posture made it clear he was tuned into the situation. Other passengers shifted in their seats, stealing glances toward Michael and Karen, unsure how to respond to what they had just witnessed. Michael knew that for some, this would be a reminder of how subtle yet persistent discrimination could be, even in ordinary moments. For others, it would simply be an awkward incident they'd try to forget once they left the plane. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Michael took a final deep breath, determined to leave the encounter behind. The wheels lifted, and soon the plane soared into the sky, carrying him closer to home. Yet even as the city below faded, Karen's words lingered in his mind. The tense silence left by the confrontation between Karen and Michael lingered over the first-class cabin like a heavy cloud. Karen, still visibly irritated, crossed her arms and turned slightly away from Michael, as though his presence alone offended her. She glared at the seat back in front of her, occasionally shifting in her seat, her anger palpable in her stiff posture. Michael, however, had long since stopped paying her any mind. He redirected his attention inward, away from the woman who tried to belittle him, and toward the familiar feelings her actions had stirred. Leaning back, he fixed his gaze out the small window, watching as the ground below grew smaller and more distant. The engine's steady hum provided a strange sense of calm after everything that had happened. Unbeknownst to both Michael and Karen, a quiet observer from a few rows behind had been watching the entire exchange. John was a well-known figure in the business world, familiar to anyone who followed the news or philanthropy. Despite his casual attire for the flight, he carried an unmistakable quiet authority, a presence shaped by years of experience, wisdom, and success. He had boarded shortly after Karen and Michael, slipping into his seat without drawing attention, largely unnoticed by the other passengers. As he settled in, he quickly sensed the tension between the two seated ahead of him. Karen's haughty demeanor was hard to ignore, and her increasingly rude comments drew his attention. Initially, John observed with mild curiosity, assuming it might be a simple misunderstanding. But as Karen and Michael's exchange continued, his curiosity shifted to disgust. The condescension in Karen's voice, her presumptuous attitude toward Michael, and the way she insisted on the flight attendant checking his ticket, it was all too familiar to John. John had encountered people like Karen before, those who wore entitlement like a badge and thought their status or wealth made them superior. It was a mindset he despised, one he'd spent his life pushing against in both business and charity work. As a philanthropist, John had dedicated much of his time to causes aimed at tackling inequality and promoting social justice. He had always believed in using his influence to drive change, but moments like this reminded him of just how far society still had to go. He wanted to step in, to say something that would silence Karen and show support for Michael. But something held him back. Maybe it was Michael's way of handling the situation, calm, steady, and full of quiet strength. John recognized that kind of composure. It was the product of years spent navigating a world where judgments were often made before a word was even spoken. He had seen that same strength in friends, colleagues, and sometimes in himself. So for now, John chose to stay silent, watching as Michael maintained his poise in the face of Karen's antagonism. He knew it wasn't his place to intervene, at least not yet. Michael had handled the situation with dignity, and John respected that. But he wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. Determination grew within him as he observed Karen's frustration, her lips pressed tight with silent anger. As the boarding process continued, other passengers settled in, casting uneasy glances toward the front of the cabin. The tension between Karen and Michael lingered, and it was clear many had witnessed the confrontation. But, like John, they chose to stay silent, whether out of discomfort or a reluctance to get involved. The unease hung heavy, but no one addressed it. Michael, meanwhile, did his best to ignore the stares. He had faced situations like this before and knew how to endure them. His years in the military had instilled patience, resilience, and an understanding of when to pick his battles. This, as frustrating as it was, wasn't a fight worth having. He had nothing to prove to Karen or anyone else in that cabin. Michael knew who he was, and he was certain of the sacrifices he had made. As the plane reached cruising altitude, he leaned his head back against the seat, his thoughts drifting to his military service. There was a painful irony to the situation. He had spent years defending his country, fighting for the very freedoms that allowed people like Karen to voice their prejudices without consequence. And yet, despite his service, despite the medals and recognition he had earned, he was still viewed as lesser, simply because of his skin color. This feeling wasn't new. Michael had faced discrimination throughout his life, and even as he Jenkins in the ranks, he encountered times when his value was questioned because of his race. But he had learned to rise above it, to focus on what truly mattered: his family, his comrades, and the values he held close. He fought for his country, not because he saw it as flawless, but because he believed it could be better. Sitting there, gazing out at the endless sky, Michael couldn't help but feel a familiar frustration. How many times would he have to prove himself? How many more moments like this would he need to endure? He had given so much to a country that in many ways Elle refused to see him as equal. But then he thought of his family, his wife, who had stood by him through every deployment, and his daughter, who had grown up too fast in his absence. There was a reason he had pushed through all the hardships and moments of doubt. Soon, he'd be home with his family, and that was what truly mattered. He shifted in his seat and glanced over at Karen, who was still silently fuming. She hadn't spoken to him since the flight attendant confirmed his seat, but her body language was unmistakable. She hadn't let go of her resentment. Michael, however, had finished engaging with her. She could stew in her frustration as much as she wanted. He wasn't about to let her ruin this moment. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin with drinks and snacks, John continued observing from behind. He reflected on what he'd just witnessed, thinking about how often situations like this played out, even in places that were supposed to be progressive or inclusive. It was a clear reminder that despite the progress, there were still deep-rooted issues that needed to be addressed. But John wasn't one to simply stand by and do nothing. John had spent years fighting for change, and he wasn't about to let this moment pass without action. He'd seen Michael's quiet strength, his ability to remain dignified despite Karen's condescension, and it left a lasting impression on him. John had always believed in honoring those who embodied resilience, dignity, and integrity, qualities Michael had shown in abundance. As the flight attendants moved down the aisle, John made a decision. He didn't know exactly how he would act, but he knew he couldn't let this go unacknowledged. He felt compelled to offer his support to the man who'd shown such grace in the face of blatant disrespect. For now, though, he stayed silent, waiting for the right moment. Timing was everything, and he was confident there would be a time soon to act. For now, he chose to let Michael have his peace. Michael had earned it. As the flight continued, Michael's mind drifted once more. He thought back to his last deployment, the missions he'd completed, and the camaraderie he'd shared with his fellow soldiers. In the military, race didn't matter as much as loyalty, trust, and the ability to get the job done. A stark contrast to the civilian world, where people like Karen judged him without knowing a thing about him. Yet Michael knew change was possible. He'd seen it in the small daily acts of unity among his comrades who stood by each other without regard for backgrounds, coming together under a shared purpose. He believed the outside world could learn from this. Change was slow and often difficult, but it was achievable. As the plane continued its journey, Michael closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engines bring him into a calm, reflective state. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let people like Karen hold him back. He'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to be diminished by narrow-mindedness. And as he sat there, unaware of the quiet observer behind him, he couldn't have known that this flight was about to take a surprising turn, one that would remind him that there were still those who believed in doing the right thing. John, too, remained deep in thought, his gaze fixed on the back of Karen's seat. He had seen enough and was ready to take action. But for now, he waited, already forming a plan for what he would do once the plane landed. The flight might have seemed uneventful on the surface, but something much more profound was brewing. Neither Michael nor Karen knew just how impactful this journey would become. The plane touched down softly, the engines shifting as they taxied toward the gate. For most passengers, the end of the flight brought relief, but for Michael, it marked the end of an experience he wouldn't soon forget. He'd stayed composed, keeping his dignity intact in the face of Karen's arrogance. As the plane slowed, the exhaustion of the day caught up with him. He stretched in his seat, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. After a long deployment, all he wanted was to be with his family. He pictured his wife's welcoming smile and the way his daughter would run to him, arms open wide. It made the wait for the plane to come to a complete stop even harder. Across the aisle, Karen was already gathering her things, her posture stiff, her face still set with that look of superiority. Since the flight attendant confirmed his ticket, Karen hadn't uttered another word to Michael. Although her silence might have suggested retreat, she clearly thought she'd won the encounter. To her, Michael's calm demeanor must have appeared as submission. She hadn't apologized or acknowledged her mistake. As passengers began standing and reaching for their bags, Karen gave Michael a brief dismissive glance before fully turning her back on him. She had no idea she'd been sitting next to a decorated soldier, someone who'd spent years serving his country. But that didn't matter to her. All she saw was what was on the surface, content to stay in her ignorance. Michael, meanwhile, had already moved on. He grabbed his bag, stood up, and gave the cabin one last look. The other passengers, many of whom had observed the tense exchange, seemed eager to disembark, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. As they left, Michael felt the weight of their glances, but he paid them no mind. He had more important things to think about: home, family, and the end of a long journey. As he stepped into the terminal, the cool airport air hit him, and for the first time in hours, he let himself relax a little. He was almost there, almost home. But as he started walking through the terminal, something unexpected happened. From behind him, a polite yet firm voice called out, "Excuse me, sir. Michael, isn't it?" Michael turned to see a man approaching, casually dressed but exuding a quiet confidence. At first, Michael didn't recognize him, but then it clicked. This man had been seated a few rows back, silently observing the earlier incident with Karen. "Yes?" Michael responded cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man smiled and extended his hand. John Carter." Michael shook his hand, still uncertain of the man's intentions. The name sounded familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. "I was on the flight with you," John explained, his tone serious yet calm. "I saw what happened with that woman. Karen, right?" Michael nodded, his face neutral. "Yeah, I remember." John paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I just wanted to say, I was impressed by how you handled yourself. That kind of grace in a situation like that says a lot about your character. Most people would have lost their temper." Michael shrugged a bit. "I've dealt with worse. It's not worth the energy." John's expression softened in understanding. "I can imagine you have, but still, I wanted to tell you that what you did mattered. To me, and I'm sure to others who saw it." Compliments like this from strangers weren't something Michael was used to, so he shifted, slightly unsure of how to respond. "I appreciate that. But really it was nothing." "No, it wasn't nothing," John said firmly. "And I'd like to talk to you about something, if you have a moment." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" John gestured for him to walk with him through the terminal. "I run a charity organization. We focus on helping veterans and supporting minority-owned businesses. And after seeing how you handled yourself back there, I think you'd be a great fit for a role we have. It's something I'd love to discuss with you." Michael was taken aback. He'd expected a quick thank you from a fellow passenger who'd seen the encounter, but this was entirely different. He followed John as they walked, curiosity piqued. What kind of role are we talking about? Michael asked, his voice cautious yet intrigued. John smiled as they reached a quieter part of the terminal, away from the crowds. We're always looking for people with strong leadership skills, people who can inspire others and help guide our mission. You clearly have those skills. I saw it back on the plane. You didn't let her words get to you. That's the kind of resilience we need. Michael listened closely, still processing everything. I've done my time in the military. I was planning to take a break, focus on my family for a bit. John nodded in understanding. And I respect that. But this wouldn't be full-time. It's something you could do on your own terms, and the impact you'd have, it would be significant. Michael was at a loss for words. The idea of working for an organization that helped veterans and minority-owned businesses appealed to him. But this offer had come so unexpectedly. He'd just been trying to get home and put the incident with Karen behind him, but now it seemed that moment had led him somewhere new, somewhere he hadn't anticipated. What kind of impact are we talking about? Michael asked after a pause. John's eyes brightened. We're working on several projects right now. One of the biggest is a mentorship program for veterans transitioning to civilian life. You'd be able to guide them, help them find their footing, and share your experiences. He continued, we're also supporting minority-owned businesses with grants, giving them a hand to start or expand. Michael nodded slowly, considering the possibilities. He had always wanted to find a meaningful way to serve after his time in the military. This opportunity seemed to appear out of nowhere, but maybe that was the point. John must have noticed Michael's hesitation, because he added, look, I don't expect you to give me an answer right now, but I'd love for you to come to a meeting with the team, see what we're about. I think you'd be impressed with what we're doing. Michael looked at John, still uncertain, but he could feel a spark of excitement building. A meeting, huh? He replied. John grinned. Yeah, we're based not far from here. How about tomorrow? No pressure. Just come by and see what we're working on. Michael considered the invitation for a long moment before nodding. All right, I'll come by. The two men shook hands again, and as they did, Michael felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in a long time. This wasn't just a random encounter. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter. As he walked away, heading to reunite with his family, he couldn't help but feel thankful for the unexpected turn in his journey. The next day, Michael arrived at the address John had given him, a modest yet professional building nestled in the heart of the city. He didn't know what to expect, but the moment he walked through the doors, he felt warmth and a clear sense of purpose. The walls were decorated with photos of veterans and their families, alongside snapshots of smiling entrepreneurs at ribbon-cutting ceremonies for their new businesses. John met him at the entrance, greeting him with the same friendly smile from the day before. Glad you made it, he said, leading Michael down the hall to a conference room where a few team members were already seated. As the meeting got underway, Michael listened to John and the others discuss their projects, becoming more and more engaged. The work they were doing felt real and impactful, providing much-needed support to veterans and minority-owned businesses, and he could see it was changing lives. As the discussion continued, Michael could see how he might fit into their work. When the meeting wrapped up, John looked at him hopefully. So, what do you think? Michael smiled, feeling more certain than he had in a while. I think I'm in. Over the next few weeks, Michael embraced his new role, bringing his experience and leadership skills to help guide veterans through their transitions and support minority-owned businesses. The work was challenging, yet deeply fulfilling, and he found a renewed sense of purpose in it. Meanwhile, Karen remained oblivious to the ripple effect her behavior on that flight had set in motion. She walked away from the incident, feeling she had somehow won, not realizing that her actions had only fueled Michael's resolve to make a difference. And as Michael continued his work, he knew one thing for sure. No matter how people like Karen tried to bring him down, he would always rise above. Little did he know, the encounter on the plane was about to take on a life of its own. Unbeknownst to both Michael and Karen, a fellow passenger had quietly recorded their interaction with a smartphone. The video, capturing Karen's condescending words and Michael's composed response, was about to go viral. A college student named Chris, seated a few rows back, had witnessed the exchange. Initially reluctant to intervene, Chris sensed the importance of the moment and decided to document it. After considering it for a day, Chris shared the video online, hoping to start a conversation about racial prejudice in everyday life. Within hours, the video spread like wildfire across social media, racking up millions of views and sparking heated discussions. The hashtag #FirstClassRacism began trending, with people from all walks of life weighing in. Comments poured in, overwhelmingly supporting Michael. "This man's calm in the face of disrespect is incredible. True strength right here. How is this still happening in 2024? Her behavior is disgusting. I hope the airline bans her for life. This kind of racism has no place in society." As the video continued circulating, it caught the attention of major news outlets. Soon, the story appeared on national broadcasts, with anchors and commentators analyzing the incident and discussing its broader implications. One anchor introduced the segment saying, "A shocking display of racial prejudice on a first-class flight has sparked a nationwide discussion on privilege and discrimination." The viral video, now with over 10 million views, shows a woman identified as Karen Hartley questioning a black man's right to sit in first class. The public's reaction was swift and intense, with many people calling for repercussions. It didn't take long for internet sleuths to identify Karen and trace her back to her employer, a well-known marketing firm in New York City. As the backlash grew, Karen's employer found itself in the midst of a PR disaster. Angry messages flooded their social media channels, demanding immediate action. Emily Roberts, the company's CEO, quickly recognized the seriousness of the situation. At an emergency meeting with her executive team, Emily paced, visibly tense. "We need to address this right away," she said, her tone firm. "If we stay silent, people will think we condone this behavior." One executive suggested, "Maybe we should wait it out. These things usually blow over." But Emily shook her head decisively. "No, waiting is not an option. Our values emphasize diversity and inclusion. Not acting now would make us hypocrites." After a heated discussion, they reached a decision. Emily prepared a statement condemning Karen's behavior and announcing her immediate dismissal. It read, "We at Roberts Marketing are deeply disturbed by the recent video involving one of our employees. The behavior displayed is inconsistent with everything our company represents. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Effective immediately, Karen Hartley is no longer with our organization." As word of Karen's firing spread, the public's reaction was mixed. Many praised the company for swift action, while others questioned if the punishment was fair. The incident sparked wider conversations about social media accountability and employers' roles in addressing employees' actions outside of work. Completely unaware of the storm brewing, Karen was blindsided by her abrupt termination. She showed up at work one morning to find her access card disabled and security waiting to escort her out. Shocked, she tried to explain to her co-workers, "It's just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice edged with panic. "They're blowing this out of proportion." But her protests were met with silence. As she left the building, the reality sank in. Her comfortable life was unraveling, all because of one moment of prejudice captured on video. In the days that followed, Karen's life turned into a nightmare of public scrutiny and personal crisis. She was recognized on the street, with people hurling insults and calling her a racist. Her social media accounts were bombarded with angry messages, forcing her to shut them down. Even friends and family began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Desperate to redeem herself, Karen agreed to an interview with a local news station. Sitting across from the interviewer, her usual confidence was replaced with an anxious demeanor. "Miss Hartley," the interviewer began, "what do you have to say about your actions on that flight?" Shifting uneasily, Karen responded, "I realize now that my behavior was inappropriate," her voice wavering. "But I want people to know that I'm not a racist. It was just a misunderstanding." The interviewer pressed, "But the video clearly shows you questioning the gentleman's right to be in first class based on his appearance. How is that not racist?" At that, Karen's composure began to crack. "I was tired. I wasn't thinking clearly," she stammered. "I've never had issues with people of color before. I have black friends." Her weak defenses only intensified public anger. Social media erupted with memes and parodies of her interview, cementing her as a symbol of entitled racism. While Karen faced the fallout from her actions, Michael's story was taking a different path. The same video that exposed Karen's prejudice also highlighted Michael's calm and dignified response. Many were struck by how composed he remained, despite the disrespect. Seeing an opportunity to further their mission, John's charity decided to feature Michael in a new anti-discrimination campaign. They created a series of videos where Michael shared his experiences and discussed the importance of respecting all people. In one video, he looked directly into the camera, his voice steady and sincere. "What happened to me on that flight isn't unique," he said. "People of color face these kinds of microaggressions every day, but we have a choice in how we respond. We can let it break us down, or we can use it as fuel to drive positive change." The campaign resonated with people nationwide, and Michael's message of resilience and hope touched many who had faced similar discrimination. Donations to the charity surged, allowing them to expand their support for veterans and minority-owned businesses. Michael soon found himself in the spotlight, receiving invitations to speak at conferences and events across the country. Initially reluctant to embrace the attention, he preferred to stay focused on the work rather than his newfound visibility. But as time went on, he realized that his platform could create meaningful change. During a particularly impactful speech at a national racial equity conference, Michael addressed a packed auditorium. "The incident on that plane was just a moment," he began, his voice resonating through the silent crowd. "But it represents a much larger issue in our society. We need to have honest conversations about race and privilege. We need to challenge our own biases and stand up against discrimination wherever we see it." The crowd responded with resounding applause, with many rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Michael's message resonated, encouraging people to reflect on their own behavior and strive for a more inclusive community. As Michael's influence spread, so did the reach of John's charity. They teamed up with large corporations to implement diversity and inclusion training. They expanded grants for minority-owned businesses, boosting job creation and growth in underserved communities. Their veteran programs also grew, providing critical support to those who had served. One day, after a meeting at the charity's office, Michael ran into John in the hallway. John clapped him on the shoulder, a proud grin on his face. "You know, Michael," he said, "when I saw you on that plane, I knew you were something special. But I had no idea just how much of an impact you'd have." Michael returned the smile, a mix of gratitude and resolve in his eyes. "I'm just glad I can use my experience to help others," he replied. "Every day, I'm reminded of why this work matters so much." As they walked towards the exit, John chuckled. "You know, in a strange way, we almost owe Karen a thank you. Her actions that day set all of this in motion." Michael shook his head thoughtfully. "I don't think we owe her anything, but I do hope she's learned something from all this. Maybe in some way, this whole experience has opened her eyes." Stepping out into the sunshine, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. From facing discrimination on a plane to becoming a force for change, his life had taken an unexpected path. Looking back at the charity's building, with its mission, empowering change, embracing diversity, Michael knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The event that started it all, a moment of prejudice caught on video, had sparked a national conversation. It had cost Karen her job and reputation, highlighting the consequences of unchecked bias. Yet it had also elevated Michael, turning him into a symbol of grace under pressure and a driving force for positive change. As Michael drove home that night, he thought about the lives he'd impacted. Veterans finding their footing in civilian life, minority entrepreneurs gaining the support they needed to succeed, and countless people encouraged to confront their own biases. He couldn't help but smile at the irony. Karen's attempt to diminish him had instead propelled him into a position to make a real difference. It was a powerful reminder that life's toughest moments can lead to the most unexpected and rewarding opportunities. As he pulled into his driveway, Michael saw his wife and daughter waiting on the porch. Their faces brightened as he stepped out, and he was reminded again of what mattered most: family, purpose, and the chance to leave the world a little better. The public reaction against Karen and Michael's newfound influence had created a ripple effect, impacting lives far beyond that first-class cabin. It was proof of the power of standing up against injustice, a reminder that one person's dignity in the face of discrimination could inspire countless others. As the uproar around the viral video started to settle, the effects of that flight kept expanding, reaching people far beyond Michael and Karen. The video sparked a national conversation on race, privilege, and accountability, leading to unforeseen consequences and opportunities for many involved. For Michael, life took on a new rhythm, and his work with John's charity became much more than a job. It was a calling. Each day brought new challenges and rewards as he worked to expand the charity's reach and influence. On a particular morning, Michael prepared for a meeting with a potential sponsor, a Fortune 500 company interested in partnering with the charity for a national diversity initiative. Adjusting his tie, he glanced at the framed newspaper clipping on his office wall. The headline read, "From First-Class Confrontation to First-Class Citizen, Michael Roberts' Journey." He shook his head, still amazed at how a difficult moment had led to such positive change. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was John, looking eager. "Michael, you ready? The CEO of Carter Industries is waiting in the conference room." Michael nodded, taking a steadying breath. "Let's do this." As they headed to the conference room, John filled him in on the details. Facing intense backlash, Karen's former employer quickly found itself in a PR crisis, with social media flooded by angry calls for action. Their CEO, Emily Roberts, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. She gathered her executive team, her tone resolute. "We need to respond immediately," she said. "Our silence could look like we condone this behavior." One executive suggested waiting it out, saying, "These things usually blow over in a few days." But Emily shook her head. "No, we can't just wait. Our company's values stand for diversity and inclusion. We have to act." After some heated discussion, they made the decision. Karen would be terminated. Emily's public statement read, "We at Roberts Marketing are deeply troubled by the video involving one of our employees. The behavior displayed does not align with our company's values. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Effective immediately, Karen Hartley is no longer employed by our organization." As the news spread, reactions were mixed. Some praised the swift action, while others debated whether the punishment was appropriate. The incident ignited a wider discussion on accountability in the digital age and the responsibilities of employers regarding personal behavior. Meanwhile, Karen, oblivious to the growing firestorm, arrived at work to find her access revoked and security ready to escort her out. In disbelief, she tried to justify herself to her colleagues. "It's just a misunderstanding," she insisted, panic in her voice. "They're blowing this way out of proportion." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. As she left the building, the reality of her situation began to sink in. Her life was unraveling due to one moment of prejudice caught on camera. In the aftermath, Karen's life became a whirlwind of public shame and personal crisis. People recognized her on the street, hurling insults and accusations. Her social media accounts were bombarded with hate, forcing her to shut them down. Friends and family started to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. In desperation, she agreed to an interview, hoping to redeem herself. Sitting across from the interviewer, her usual confidence was replaced with anxiety. "Ms. Hartley," the interviewer began, "what do you have to say about your actions on that flight?" Karen squirmed, her voice shaky. "I realize now that my behavior was inappropriate," she managed, "but I want people to know that I'm not a racist. It was just a misunderstanding." The interviewer pressed, "But the video shows you questioning his right to be in first class based on appearance. How is that not racism?" Her facade cracked. "I was tired, not thinking straight," she stammered. "I've never had issues with people of color. I even have black friends." Her attempts to explain only fueled public anger, and social media quickly filled with memes mocking her interview. Meanwhile, Michael's life took a very different turn. The same video that exposed Karen's bias highlighted Michael's calm dignity, capturing the public's admiration. John's charity saw an opportunity and launched an anti-discrimination campaign featuring Michael, with videos discussing his experiences and promoting respect and empathy. In one of the videos, Michael spoke directly to viewers. "What happened to me on that flight isn't unique. People of color face these kinds of microaggressions daily, but we have a choice in how we respond. We can let it wear us down, or we can turn it into motivation to bring about positive change." The campaign struck a chord nationwide, and donations to the charity surged, enabling them to expand their programs for veterans and minority-owned businesses. Michael's quiet strength in adversity resonated with audiences, and he found himself speaking at conferences across the country. Though initially hesitant about his newfound prominence, he recognized the chance to make a meaningful impact. At one conference, addressing a packed crowd, Michael said, "The incident on that plane was just one moment, but it represents a much larger issue in society. We need to have honest conversations about race and privilege. We need to confront our own biases and stand against discrimination wherever we encounter it." The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, many rising to their feet in appreciation. Michael's story was creating real change. Carter Industries, feeling the pressure to revamp their diversity initiatives, wanted to partner with Michael and John's charity to provide mentorship, support, and training for minority employees and entrepreneurs. During a meeting with the Carter team, Michael met a familiar face. Emily Roberts, the former CEO of the company that had fired Karen. Extending her hand, she greeted him warmly. "Mr. Roberts, it's truly an honor. Your story has been inspiring for so many, myself included." Michael, surprised, replied, "Ms. Roberts, it seems we have a mutual connection." Emily's smile wavered. "Yes, the incident with Karen was a wake-up call for all of us. It showed us we needed to go beyond words to truly live our values." Now, in her new role as Carter's Chief Diversity Officer, she explained, "I wanted to be part of the solution, to create real change, not just respond to crises." As they discussed Carter's plans, Emily proposed an idea that left Michael intrigued. "What if," she suggested, "we gave Karen a chance to make amends? Not just a public apology, but an opportunity for real growth and change. Michael felt a mixture of emotions at the suggestion. "What are you suggesting?" he asked cautiously. Emily continued. "She could complete our diversity program, even share her story as a learning experience. It would show that even those who make serious mistakes can learn and grow." Michael leaned back thoughtfully, considering the bold proposal. Their work was about encouraging change, so wasn't this an extension of that mission? Emily waited for his response, and after a moment, Michael nodded slowly. "It's not a decision to take lightly, but I'll think it over." After much deliberation, Michael decided to move forward with Emily's idea, with conditions. Karen would undergo a comprehensive education program, not just a one-time training. She'd need to demonstrate real growth and agree to use her story to educate others. When Emily shared the offer with Karen, she was skeptical and defensive at first. "Why would he want to help me?" she demanded, suspicion evident. Emily responded gently. "This is a sincere offer, a chance to make things right, to learn and grow." After a pause, Karen nodded, her voice softening. "Yes, I'll do it." Over the following months, Karen went through intensive training, attending workshops and having difficult conversations about race and privilege. It was challenging, and she stumbled along the way, but little by little she started to change. The final step was a meeting between Karen and Michael. As they sat across from each other in a quiet room, Karen began, her voice steady yet vulnerable. "Michael, I can't undo what I did, but I'm deeply sorry. I was arrogant and prejudiced." Michael listened intently. When she finished, he leaned forward. "Karen, I appreciate your apology, but I need to know. What have you learned?" Karen took a deep breath. "I've learned about the microaggressions people of color face daily. I've realized that my privilege has shielded me from understanding that. I now know it's not enough to just not be racist. We have to be actively anti-racist." Michael saw the genuine transformation in her and replied, "This is just the beginning of a lifelong journey." In the months that followed, Michael and Karen shared their story together in diversity training sessions, speaking about their journey from conflict to understanding. Their first presentation was nerve-wracking, but as they took turns speaking, it became clear that their story resonated with the audience. Michael spoke of the pain of being judged solely by his race and the importance of resilience, while Karen recounted her journey of facing and challenging her own biases. "What happened the day on the plane was painful," Michael said, his voice steady. "But it led to something powerful. It sparked conversations. It created change. It showed that even in difficult moments, there's a chance for growth." Their story spread, and soon they were invited to speak at various conferences, their journey of redemption becoming a lesson in empathy and transformation. "Maybe that's part of your purpose now," Michael suggested, "to help others learn these lessons without having to experience them firsthand." As they chatted, a young woman approached their table with a hint of nervousness. "Excuse me," she began, voice a little shaky. "I saw your presentation earlier. I just wanted to thank you both. It made me reflect on things about myself that I'm not proud of, but it also gave me hope that I can change." Michael and Karen shared a look, feeling a sense of fulfillment. Moments like these reminded them why they did this work, to inspire self-reflection and growth in others. After the young woman walked away, Karen turned back to Michael and asked, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Chris hadn't recorded that video? If all of this had stayed hidden?" Michael thought for a moment before replying, "I try not to focus on what-ifs, but maybe we needed to go through all this to get here." Karen nodded thoughtfully. "When this all started, I thought my life was over," Karen admitted. "I never would have guessed I'd end up here, doing this kind of work." Michael nodded in agreement. "Life's funny that way," he said. We never know where our actions might lead us. All we can do is try to make good choices, learn from our mistakes, and keep moving forward. Sitting together, this unlikely pair, brought together by conflict, felt an undeniable sense of purpose. They had taken a difficult experience and turned it into a vehicle for positive change. Their story had become more than just a viral video or a lesson on accountability. It had transformed into a testament to the power of growth, empathy, and education. In a world often divided by race and privilege, Michael and Karen's journey offered a beacon of hope, proving that even in the face of prejudice, there's always room for learning, transformation, and unity. As they stepped out of the bar and into the cool night air, both Michael and Karen felt a renewed optimism for what lay ahead. They had come a long way from that day on the plane, yet in many ways, their journey was just beginning. There were more stories to share, more minds to open, and more hearts to reach. As they went their separate ways for the night, heading to their respective hotel rooms, they carried with them a sense of pride that their collaboration was making a real difference in the world. One presentation at a time, one conversation at a time, they were working toward a more compassionate, inclusive society. The journey wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of tension, but they had learned to embrace the discomfort. Those uncomfortable moments, they realized, were often where the most profound growth happened. They were learning to lean into the hard conversations, encouraging others to do the same. That night, as Michael lay in bed reflecting on the day, he marveled at the unexpected path his life had taken, from a decorated soldier to a man who faced discrimination to a force for positive change. He thought of the young woman who had approached them earlier, and the countless others who had shared similar stories of self-reflection and growth. It was a powerful reminder of why their work mattered. Across town, in her own hotel room, Karen was lost in similar thoughts. She looked at herself in the mirror, recalling the entitled person she used to be. The journey of self-discovery hadn't been easy, but she wouldn't trade it for anything. As both Michael and Karen drifted off to sleep that night, they felt a profound sense of purpose and hope. They knew there was still much to be done, more minds to open, and more lives to change. Yet they were ready for the challenge. Their journey, a story of conflict, self-growth, and reconciliation, had become a powerful tool for change. And as they looked toward the future, both Michael and Karen were committed to using their experiences to build a more compassionate, understanding world. Their story served as a reminder that even in our darkest times, there's always potential for growth and transformation, that with empathy, education, and a willingness to change, we can overcome our biases and create bridges across the divides between us. As the city slept, Michael and Karen rested, ready to face another day of impactful conversations and meaningful work. Their journey was far from over, but it was just beginning to inspire change on a broader scale. Michael's resilience in the face of discrimination had ignited a transformative journey, one that had a lasting impact not only on those directly involved, but on many who heard his story. The unexpected events had unveiled deeper truths and sparked a powerful message of redemption and change. If Michael's journey inspired you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage and impact. And before you leave, we'd love to hear from you. How do you think you would handle a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below.